Before watching, please press like to support me in producing more stories. This helps in spreading the video and reaching more people. Thank you for your support and enjoy watching. The trading post sat like a weathered sentinel at the crossroads of nowhere and forgotten, its adobe walls the color of dried blood in the late afternoon sun. It was 1993, and while the rest of the world rushed headlong into the future, this corner of the Navajo Nation seemed to exist in a permanent state of twilight, caught between the old ways and the new. I stood in the dim back room breathing in the pungent mixture of old leather, dust, and something deeper. Something that spoke of generations of stories traded across worn wooden counters. My name is Joshua Treehorn, and I'd spent the last decade drifting between odd jobs across the Southwest, each one taking me further from who I used to be. The woman behind the counter, Loretta, according to her name tag, sized me up with the kind of careful scrutiny that came from years of separating truth from lies, in a place where both were traded as freely as turquoise and silver. "You any good with horses, Mr. Treehorn?" she asked, her voice carrying the slight rasp of too many cigarettes and too many years of desert wind. "One of the best," I assured her, ignoring the twinge of guilt at the slight exaggeration. It had been years since I'd sat properly in a saddle, but desperation has a way of making you remember skills you'd rather forget. The reservation was suffering through its third year of drought, and work was as scarce as rain. Loretta's eyes narrowed, reading something in my face that I thought I'd hidden better. "Got a fellow who might take you on," she said slowly, "but he's particular. Needs someone who can handle the quiet." "You a talker, Mr. Treehorn?" A ghost of a smile crossed my lips. I've been known to spin a yarn or two. The truth was, I'd learned the value of silence in my years alone. Sometimes the stories you don't tell are the ones that keep you alive. That seemed to satisfy her. She scribbled an address on a crumpled receipt, her handwriting as jagged as the mesas that dominated the horizon. "Head north towards Shiprock. He's about 10 miles out. Big old white ranch house, got a horse barn behind it. Name's Walter Duncan." She paused, something flickering behind her eyes. "Tell him Loretta sent you." I'd heard whispers about Walter Duncan in the bars and cafes that dotted the reservation like lonely stars. They said he was touched by something out there in the vastness, that he talked to his horses more than people, that he kept loaded rifles by every window of his house. Some said he'd seen things out in the desert that had turned his hair white overnight. Perfect. When you're running from your own shadows, sometimes the best place to hide is in someone else's darkness. The sun was beginning its slow descent as I guided my battered Ford pickup along the rutted dirt road that led to Duncan's ranch. The land out here was different from the tourist-friendly vistas closer to town. Here, the desert showed its teeth-raw red cliffs jutting up like broken bones, sparse vegetation clinging to life with stubborn determination. The silence was absolute, broken only by the labored breathing of my truck's engine and the occasional cry of a hunting hawk. As I crested a rise, the Duncan Ranch spread out before me like a mirage. It was bigger than I'd expected, at least 1,000 acres, maybe more. A sprawling white ranch house dominated the property, its paint peeling in the relentless sun. Behind it, a massive barn listed slightly to one side, as if bearing the weight of untold secrets. But it was the horses that caught my attention first. There must have been 30 or 40 of them, scattered across the pastures like dark chess pieces on a board of burnt grass. They were beautiful animals, mostly quarter horses from what I could tell, but something about their behavior set off warning bells in my mind. They moved restlessly, clustered together in tight groups, their heads up and nostrils flaring. These weren't the lazy, sun-drowsed horses you'd expect to see on a late afternoon. These animals were afraid. Walter Duncan was waiting for me on the porch, a tall, lean figure silhouetted against the dying light. He didn't move as I parked and stepped out of my truck, didn't offer any greeting or gesture of welcome. He just watched, still as a rattler before the strike as I approached the house. "Mr. Duncan? Loretta at the trading post sent me. I'm Joshua Treehorn, here about the work." He studied me for a long moment, his face weathered as old leather, eyes the pale blue of winter sky. When he finally spoke, his voice was surprisingly soft, almost gentle, but edged with something I couldn't quite name. "You believe in things you can't see, Mr. Treehorn?" It wasn't the opening question I'd expected from a potential employer, but years of living on the reservation had taught me to respect the roundabout way conversations sometimes needed to unfold. "The old stories?" I shrugged. "Some truth in them, I suppose. Spirits, skinwalkers, maybe." Duncan's eyes narrowed, and I saw something flash across his face. Relief? Recognition? "Not stories," he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Things. Out there in the darkness. Things that don't follow the rules." He turned abruptly and pushed open the heavy wooden door, gesturing for me to follow him inside. The interior of the ranch house was like stepping into another world, or perhaps another time. Taxidermied animals lined the walls, their glass eyes reflecting the last rays of sunlight that filtered through dusty windows. The air hummed with a low, persistent buzz I couldn't quite place, and the smell, something beyond the expected musty scent of an old house. Something metallic, almost electric. Duncan pointed to a worn leather armchair and waited until I sat before he began to pace, his boots making no sound on the thick Persian rug that covered most of the floor. "Something's been at my herd," he said without preamble. "Killing horses, not for food, for sport, almost seems." He stopped pacing suddenly, fixing me with that pale, intense gaze. "The thing out there, it's not right, not natural." I felt my heart begin to thud against my ribs, though I couldn't have said exactly why. This was why folks kept their distance from Walter Duncan. The man wasn't just odd, he was touched, as the elders would say. I chose my next words carefully. "Look, whatever's bothering your horses, maybe it's a mountain lion. Maybe coyotes got too big for their britches. I'm a decent enough tracker, can help you find it, put it down." But Duncan wasn't listening anymore. His focus had shifted, his entire body going rigid as he stared at a point over my shoulder. Following his gaze, I felt my blood turn to ice water in my veins. There, framed in the doorway leading to the kitchen, stood the largest, blackest dog I'd ever seen. Its eyes burned like embers in the gathering darkness, and a low growl rumbled in its chest, a sound that seemed to come from somewhere far deeper than any earthly creature's throat. But what froze me in place wasn't its size or its eyes. It was the shape of it, the way it moved. Wrong somehow, as if its body was assembled from parts that didn't quite fit together. "You see it, don't you?" Walter's voice was a hoarse whisper. "It's here, right now." I nodded, unable to speak. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to flee this house and this man and whatever hell-spawned thing stood before us. But some deeper part of me, a part that echoed with the old stories of my ancestors, kept me rooted in place. The dog thing took a step forward, its guttural growl escalating into something that made my teeth ache. It didn't move like a normal dog, its limbs too long, its joints bending at impossible angles. Walter reached under an end table, pulling out an old lever-action rifle with the smooth motion of long practice. "Can you shoot?" His voice was eerily calm now. "You bet," I said, surprised to find my own voice steady. "Then we might just survive the night," he said grimly, raising the rifle. "Thing is, bullets might not be enough." I took a steadying breath. I didn't know if I believed in monsters, but I believed in what I was seeing. And something told me this wouldn't be some simple hunt. This was something older. Something that walked the line between the world I knew and the one I'd spent my life trying to ignore. The dog thing snarled and lunged, a blur of darkness and teeth. The night had only just begun. The creature moved with impossible speed, dodging Walter's first shot, like it knew exactly where the bullet would go. The sound of the rifle blast echoed off the walls, momentarily drowning out the beast's growl. The acrid smell of gunpowder filled my nostrils, mixing with an older, fouler stench that seemed to emanate from the thing itself, like wet fur and rotting meat and something else, something that had no name in any human language. As Walter chambered another round, my mind flashed back to the last time I'd faced death, It was 5 years ago, up in the Chuska Mountains, when a routine hiking trip had gone sideways. I'd been leading a group of tourists, rich folks from back east who wanted to experience the real Southwest. The memory hit me with crystalline clarity, even as I dove behind an overturned table. "The legs!" Walter shouted, snapping me back to the present. "Aim for its legs!" The creature had leaped onto his kitchen table, sending decades-old china crashing to the floor. In the dim light, its form seemed to shift and flow like smoke, but there was nothing insubstantial about the claws that left deep gouges in the wood. I'd started guiding tours after my father passed, using the skills he'd taught me about the land, the tracking, the survival techniques that had been passed down through generations. Dad had been one of the last true horsemen of the old school, equally comfortable in the saddle or reading weather patterns in the dawn sky. He'd tried to teach me everything he knew, but I'd been too eager to leave, too convinced that the modern world had more to offer than ancient wisdom and patient observation. The creature's claws raked across my shoulder, tearing through my jacket like it was tissue paper. The pain was immediate and intense, but different from any animal attack I'd experienced. It burned like ice, a cold so severe it felt like fire. "Joshua!" Walter's voice carried a note of desperate command. "The fireplace, remember what I told you? What he told me?" My thoughts were scattered, fragmented by pain and fear. Then it hit me, the old stories. The ones my grandmother used to tell around the fire on winter nights, when the wind howled outside like a hungry thing seeking entrance. Stories of creatures that could only be destroyed by flame. The fireplace was maybe 15 feet away, an ancient stone hearth that looked like it had been here since the house was built. A few embers still glowed weakly among the ashes. Walter had mentioned matches earlier, but where? The beast lunged again, and this time Walter met it with the butt of his rifle, a solid crack that would have killed any normal animal. The creature barely seemed to notice. Its eyes, God, its eyes. They weren't just red now. They were changing, shifting through colors that shouldn't exist. "Your pocket," Walter grunted, struggling to keep the thing at bay. "Left them in your pocket." He was right. The box of matches was there, the weight of it suddenly the most important thing in the world. But as I pulled them out, another memory surfaced, this one darker, more recent. The real reason I'd left the guiding business, the real reason I'd been drifting from job to job across the reservation. It had been a cave up near Canyon de Shelley, a simple day hike, nothing I hadn't done 100 times before. But something had been different that day. The shadows had been deeper, the silence more complete, and there had been tracks in the dust, tracks that made no sense, that seemed to start and stop at random, that belonged to nothing I'd ever seen in all my years in the wilderness. "Now, Joshua!" Walter's voice cracked with urgency. "It has to be now!" I struck the first match with trembling fingers, watching the small flame spring to life. The creature's head snapped toward me, nostrils flaring. For a moment, just a moment, I saw something in those impossible eyes. Recognition, maybe even fear. The memory of the cave crashed over me again. The tracks had led deeper and I'd followed them, ignoring every instinct that screamed at me to turn back. My clients had waited at the entrance, but I'd had to know, had to see, and in the deepest chamber, in darkness so complete it seemed alive, I'd found something that had changed everything I thought I knew about the world. The match burned my fingers, jolting me back to reality. The creature was coiling itself, preparing to spring. Walter had positioned himself between us, but his rifle was empty now, useful only as a club. Time seemed to slow, each heartbeat lasting an eternity. I struck another match, then another, dropping them into the fireplace where small tongues of flame began to lick at the old wood. The creature watched, its form seeming to ripple and distort. Was it larger now? The shadows it cast on the wall certainly were, stretching and twisting into shapes that hurt my eyes to look at. "The sage!" Walter shouted. "On the mantel!" A small bundle of dried sage lay there, wrapped in red thread. I grabbed it, tossing it into the growing flames. The effect was immediate. A sharp, clean smell cut through the creature's foul stench, and it let out a sound that was almost human in its anguish. That sound, I'd heard it before, in that cave 5 years ago. The same otherworldly howl that had sent me running in blind panic, leaving behind... what? I still couldn't remember exactly what I'd seen that day. My mind had blocked it out, the same way it blocks out trauma too terrible to process. The fire was roaring now, and Walter was backing slowly toward me, his eyes never leaving the creature. "You remember now, don't you?" he asked softly. "Remember what they really are?" I did. My grandmother's stories came flooding back, tales of beings that walked between worlds, that wore darkness like a second skin. The Navajo had many names for them, but one in particular rang in my mind. Yi Nal Lushi, Skinwalker. But this was something else. Something older. The fire cast wild shadows across its form as it paced before us, and in those shadows I caught glimpses of what it really was. Something that had never been human, had never even been animal. Something that had existed in the dark spaces of the world since before there were words to name it. "The adversary," Walter whispered, and the creature's head snapped up at the word, its entire form seeming to vibrate with hatred. The old ones knew. They left warnings, if you know where to look. The cave. The memories were coming faster now. The petroglyphs I'd found deep inside, ancient drawings that depicted this exact creature, locked in eternal battle with figures wielding fire. How long had it been here, haunting these lands? How many others had encountered it over the centuries? The fire was at full blaze now, and I could feel its heat on my face. The creature had backed away slightly, but it wasn't retreating. It was gathering itself for one final attack. In its eyes, I saw an intelligence that was utterly alien, yet terrifyingly aware. It knew us, knew our kind, had known us for longer than we had known ourselves. Walter pressed something into my hand, a small pouch that smelled of herbs and something metallic. "When it comes," he said, his voice steady despite everything, "throw this into the fire, and whatever happens next, whatever you see, don't look away. You need to remember this time." The creature tensed, its form seeming to grow larger, darker, more terrible with each passing second. As it gathered itself for the final spring, I found myself thinking of all the stories I'd dismissed over the years, all the warnings I'd ignored. The world was older and darker than I'd ever imagined, and here, in this room with this impossible thing, I was about to learn just how deep that darkness went. The adversary launched itself toward us, a mass of shadow and teeth and ancient, hungry malevolence. I gripped the pouch Walter had given me, knowing that the next few seconds would either kill us or change us forever. Probably both. Time to find out which. Time slowed to a crawl as I hurled the pouch into the flames. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The fire exploded upward, turning from orange to a searing blue-white that burned itself into my retinas. The creature was already airborne, its massive form blotting out everything else in my field of vision. In that moment, suspended between action and consequence, I finally remembered everything about the cave. I'd seen this before, not just tracks or signs, but the thing itself. It had been waiting in that deepest chamber, coiled around ancient bones and forgotten offerings. I'd dropped my flashlight, but even in the darkness, its eyes had burned like twin stars falling into oblivion. I'd run then, leaving behind more than just my gear. I'd left behind my understanding of what was possible, what was real. Now there was nowhere to run. The impact knocked both Walter and me backwards as the creature slammed into us with the force of a freight train. Claws raked across my chest, but the pain felt distant, unimportant. The herb-filled pouch had done something to the fire, transformed it into something that felt alive, hungry. Blue-white flames reached out like grasping hands, catching hold of the creature's midnight fur. The sound it made defied description. Part scream, part roar, but underlaid with something that reminded me of radio static, of signals from deep space. Its form began to unravel. That's the only word I can think of to describe what happened next. Like a sweater coming undone, but instead of yarn, It was reality itself that was being pulled apart. "Don't look away!" Walter's voice seemed to come from very far away. "You need to see what it really is." The creature's outer form burned away like paper in a blast furnace, revealing something underneath that my mind struggled to comprehend. Geometries that shouldn't exist, patterns that made my eyes water and my temples throb. This was its true form, something that had put on flesh like a man puts on a coat, something that had never been meant to walk in our world. The fire reached deeper, and the thing's shape collapsed in on itself, folding into dimensions that shouldn't have been possible. Each movement sent ripples through the air like heat waves off hot asphalt. But these distortions seemed to affect more than just vision. Sound warped and bent. Time itself seemed to hiccup and stutter. In those moments of temporal distortion, I saw flashes of other times, other encounters. Native warriors with torches, Spanish conquistadors with blessed flame, my own ancestors facing this same creature across centuries. It had always been here, hunting on the edges of our world, taking what it wanted. And we had always fought back, passing down the knowledge of fire and sacred herbs, of how to defeat what could not be killed. The final implosion was almost anticlimactic. One moment the creature was there, a writhing mass of impossible angles and ancient hunger, and the next it was simply gone. The blue-white flames died down to normal orange, then to embers. The only sound was our ragged breathing and the settling of the old house around us. Walter broke the silence first, his voice rough with exhaustion. "Hell of a job interview, wouldn't you say?" A laugh bubbled up from somewhere deep inside me, slightly hysterical but genuine. "Does this mean I got the position?" He managed a weak smile as he pulled himself to his feet, wincing at what would definitely be impressive bruises tomorrow. "Seems like you've got the necessary experience." The cleanup took hours. Not just the physical debris, the broken furniture, the scattered artifacts, the bloody floorboards, but the metaphysical aftermath as well. Walter showed me how to cleanse the space with sage and cedar, how to lay down protective lines of blessed cornmeal, how to strengthen the barriers between our world and whatever lay beyond. As we worked, he told me more about the creature, the adversary. It wasn't a skinwalker, though it sometimes took similar forms. It was something older, something that had been here before the first people walked these lands. The Navajo had many stories about it, as did the Hopi, the Apache, and others. Each culture had its own name for it, its own rituals for fighting it, but the core truth remained the same. It could be driven back, but never truly destroyed. "It'll be back then?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Walter nodded, laying down another line of cornmeal. "Always does. Might be years, might be decades, but it remembers. And it holds grudges." The sun was rising by the time we finished, painting the desert in shades of gold and rose. Walter's horses had returned to their pastures, grazing peacefully as if nothing had happened. But they stayed in tight groups, always keeping watch. They knew, better than most, what lurked in the shadows. "So what happens now?" I asked, watching the new day dawn over the ancient land. Walter was quiet for a long moment, studying the horizon. "Now? Now you start learning. Really learning. Not just about horses and ranch work, though there'll be plenty of that. But about the old ways, the real ways. About what's really out there, and what we can do about it." He turned to face me, his eyes clear and direct. "That's why Loretta sent you to me. She sees things, knows things. Knew you were ready to remember what happened in that cave, ready to face what's really out there. Question is, are you willing to stay, to learn?" I looked out over the ranch, at the horses moving like dark shadows across the golden grass, at the red cliffs catching the first full light of morning. I thought about all the years I'd spent running, all the memories I'd tried to bury. Maybe it was time to stop running, time to stand and fight. "Yes," I said simply. "I'll stay." Walter nodded, satisfied. "Good. We'll start tomorrow. For now, let's see about getting some coffee and breakfast. Fighting ancient evils works up an appetite." As we walked back to the house, I could feel the weight of all those ancient stories settling around my shoulders like a familiar blanket. I wasn't just Joshua Treehorn anymore, drifter and failed tour guide. I was part of something older, something that stretched back through generations of watchful guardians who stood against the darkness. The sun climbed higher, burning away the last shadows of night. But we knew better now. Darkness wasn't just the absence of light. It was a living thing, hungry and patient. And somewhere out there in the spaces between what we know and what we fear, the adversary was waiting, watching, remembering. Let it watch. Let it remember. We would be ready. Years have passed since that first night at the Duncan Ranch. I'm still here, still learning. Walter's getting older now, his hair more white than gray, but his eyes are still sharp as ever. We've had other encounters with things that shouldn't exist, some worse than others, some that left scars both visible and hidden. But we've survived. We've protected what needed protecting. Sometimes, late at night when the wind howls across the desert like a hungry thing, I think about that cave where it all started. Think about the young man I was, so sure he understood how the world worked. I think about all the others who faced the darkness across the centuries, all the stories passed down in whispers and warnings. I'm a keeper of those stories now, a guardian of ancient knowledge. And sometimes when travelers stop at the trading post looking for work, looking for a fresh start, I see something in their eyes, a hint of recognition, a ghost of memory. And I think about what Loretta saw in me all those years ago. The darkness is still out there, patient and hungry as ever. But so are we, watching, waiting, ready. And the stories go on. My name is Marcus Thorne, and what I'm about to share happened to me on October 7th, 1995. The events of that weekend have haunted me ever since, changing not just how I view the wilderness, but how I understand the thin line between the known and unknown. I had decided to take my RV out for what should have been a peaceful weekend camping trip to Blackwater Falls State Park in West Virginia. It wasn't my first visit to the park. I'd been there at least half a dozen times before, drawn by its serene atmosphere and the way the falling water created a constant, soothing white noise that seemed to wash away the stress of everyday life. As a high school English teacher at Charleston West High, I desperately needed these occasional escapes from the endless stack of papers to grade and the constant chaos of teenage drama. I set off early that Friday morning with my dog Max riding shotgun, just as he had done for the past 7 years. Max was a magnificent German shepherd, 100 pounds of muscle and loyalty who had been by my side since he was a pup. Despite his imposing size and fierce appearance, he was incredibly gentle, the kind of dog who would let my students' younger siblings climb all over him during school events, yet would stand protectively between me and any stranger who approached too quickly. His dark eyes held an almost human-like intelligence, and over the years, I'd learned to trust his instincts about people and situations. The drive to the park was pleasant, with the October trees creating a canopy of red and gold above the winding mountain roads. We arrived around noon, the sun high and bright in a cloudless sky. I found a perfect spot by the Blackwater River, where the sound of rushing water provided a natural soundtrack to our wilderness retreat. The location was ideal, far enough from other campers to feel secluded, but not so remote as to be completely isolated. I took my time setting up camp, arranging the RV just right, then setting out my camping chairs with a view of both the river and the surrounding forest. The afternoon passed peacefully as I alternated between reading John Krakauer's Into the Wild, perhaps not the most appropriate choice in retrospect, and trying my luck with some fly fishing in the river. Max spent the day doing what he loved best, exploring the perimeter of our campsite, chasing squirrels up trees, and occasionally splashing in the shallower parts of the river. It was around sunset when I first noticed something was off. The temperature had dropped suddenly, as it often does in the mountains, and I was just thinking about starting a fire when I noticed Max's behavior change dramatically. He stopped his playful exploration and began pacing nervously at the forest's edge, his ears pricked forward and his tail low. What struck me most was the way he kept making these low, keening sounds. Not quite whimpers, but something more primal, almost like he was trying to warn me of something. Even now, years later, I keep my doors double locked and maintain a strict policy of never going outdoors after sunset. I've switched to teaching online courses at the local community college. I tell people it's for the flexibility, but truthfully I can't handle being alone in an empty school building anymore. The police report labeled it as a bear attack, and most people seem content with that explanation. But I know what I saw that night at Blackwater Falls. Sometimes on particularly quiet nights, when the wind rustles through the trees outside my apartment, I could swear I hear Max's warning whimper again. And occasionally, in that brief moment between sleep and waking, I catch a glimpse of those glowing red eyes in the darkness of my bedroom. They say time heals all wounds, but some experiences leave scars that never truly fade. The police investigation lasted 3 weeks, led by Detective Sarah Reeves, a veteran of the West Virginia State Police who specialized in wildlife-related incidents. I could tell from her carefully neutral expression during our interviews that she didn't believe my story, at least not the parts about the creature. She focused instead on documenting the physical evidence, the slash marks on my RV's tires, which she attributed to a bear, the destruction at the ranger station, vandals, she claimed, and poor Max's remains, which were sent to a state wildlife pathologist. The pathologist's report came back with frustratingly vague conclusions. The wounds on Max's body were inconsistent with known regional predators, but they suggested this might be due to multiple animals being involved. They found unusual saliva samples that couldn't be properly categorized. The lab results came back with contradictory markers suggesting both canine and ursine DNA. When I pressed for more specific answers, I was politely but firmly told that the state wouldn't be allocating any more resources to the investigation. My research in the months following the incident became almost obsessive. I took a semester of unpaid leave from teaching, using my savings to drive back and forth across West Virginia, interviewing locals and collecting stories. I filled notebooks with accounts from other people who'd had strange encounters in the Appalachian wilderness. A retired logger in Tucker County described finding massive, inexplicable footprints in freshly fallen snow. A highway maintenance worker showed me photographs of deer carcasses found in trees 40 feet off the ground. An elderly Cherokee woman in a nearby town told me stories passed down through generations about something her people called the Hungry One, a creature that was once human, but had been transformed by isolation and desperation into something that fed not just on flesh, but on fear itself. The local historical society proved to be an unexpected source of information. Their archives contained newspapers dating back to the 1800s, with scattered reports of similar incidents. In 1879, an entire logging camp of 12 men vanished without a trace. In 1923, a family of 4 disappeared from their homestead near the current park boundaries. Only their youngest daughter was found, wandering in the woods 3 days later, unable or unwilling to speak about what had happened. In 1957, 3 college students on a hiking trip went missing. They were found 2 weeks later, alive but severely traumatized, each telling the same story about a creature that could mimic human voices. But the more I dug, the more doors began to close. People who had initially been willing to talk suddenly claimed they couldn't remember our conversations. The Historical Society suffered a convenient basement flood that damaged many of the old newspapers I'd been studying. The wildlife pathologist who had examined Max's remains took early retirement and moved to Florida, leaving no forwarding address. Even Detective Reeves stopped returning my calls. I started seeing a therapist, Dr. Karen Mitchell, who specialized in PTSD. She helped me understand that my obsession with documenting these incidents was a way of trying to make sense of my trauma, to impose order on a chaotic and terrifying experience. She suggested that perhaps the exact nature of what I encountered that night mattered less than how I chose to move forward with my life. I knew she was right, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. Last month, I received an unmarked envelope in my mailbox. Inside was a single page from what appeared to be an old journal dated 1847. The handwriting was faded but legible, describing an encounter remarkably similar to mine. At the bottom of the page was a note in fresher ink. "You're not crazy. Be careful who you trust." I've spent hours trying to trace the paper's origin, but like everything else connected to that night, the truth remains frustratingly out of reach. I still teach, but I've moved to the city now, Charleston, where the constant noise of traffic and people helps drown out the memories of that unnatural silence in the woods. I keep Max's collar in my desk drawer, and sometimes when I'm grading papers late at night, I take it out and run my fingers over his worn name tag. I've thought about getting another dog, but it wouldn't be fair to the animal. I know now that there are things in this world that we're not equipped to understand or fight against, and I couldn't bear the responsibility of putting another loyal friend in harm's way. The official explanation remains that it was a bear attack, possibly triggered by territory encroachment or food scarcity. The Park Service posted additional warning signs about wildlife safety, and life in the area went on as usual. But every now and then I hear rumors of other incidents: hikers going missing, strange sounds in the night, unexplained livestock deaths. The locals don't talk about it much, at least not to outsiders, but you can see it in their eyes when the sun starts to set. They hurry home a little faster, lock their doors a little tighter. Some nights when I can't sleep, I find myself on my computer scanning local news sites for any unusual reports from the Blackwater Falls area. Most of the time it's quiet, but occasionally I'll find something. A missing hiker, an abandoned campsite, a series of unusual animal deaths. And every time I think about calling Detective Reeves or reaching out to the Park Service. But then I remember the look in that creature's eyes, that terrible intelligence that was neither human nor animal, and I close my laptop and try to forget. I know this story sounds unbelievable. If someone had told it to me before that weekend in 1995, I would have dismissed it as a campfire tale or a vivid imagination. But I know what I saw, what I experienced. And sometimes, knowledge is a heavier burden than uncertainty. So I keep my doors locked, my curtains drawn, and I try to find comfort in the mundane routines of daily life. But I never forget that somewhere in the mountains of West Virginia, in the deep woods around Blackwater Falls, something is waiting. Something that remembers me as clearly as I remember it. 27 years have passed since that night at Blackwater Falls, and while the acute terror has faded into a chronic unease, certain patterns have emerged that I can no longer ignore. It started with an email 3 years ago from a graduate student at West Virginia University named Jennifer Chen. She was researching disappearances in the Appalachian region for her anthropology thesis and had somehow found my old blog posts about the incident. Most of these posts had been taken down years ago, not by me, but she'd managed to find archived versions. Jennifer's research was fascinating and disturbing in equal measure. She'd created a detailed database of unexplained incidents across the Appalachian Mountains, stretching from Georgia to Maine. When plotted on a map, these incidents formed distinct clusters, with Blackwater Falls sitting at the center of one of the largest concentrations. But what caught my attention wasn't just the geographical pattern, it was the temporal one. The incidents seemed to follow a cyclical pattern, peaking every 25, 30 years. We met for coffee at a busy Starbucks in downtown Charleston. Jennifer was a serious young woman with quick eyes and a methodical approach to her research. She spread out printed maps and graphs across the table, speaking in low tones about her findings. According to her data, we were approaching another peak period. She had police reports, newspaper clippings, and interviews with dozens of witnesses who'd had encounters similar to mine. Some details varied, but certain elements remained consistent. The unnatural silence before an encounter, animals behaving strangely, the feeling of being watched, and in the few direct sightings, those distinctive red eyes. 2 weeks after our meeting, Jennifer's apartment was broken into. Her laptop, external hard drives, and research notebooks were all taken, though valuable electronics and jewelry were left untouched. The police called it a random burglary, but she and I knew better. She sent me one final email before disappearing from social media entirely. "They don't want us connecting the dots. The pattern is real. Stay safe." Her words haunted me, especially as reports began trickling in from the Blackwater Falls area over the next few months. 3 hikers disappeared in separate incidents. A wildlife photographer's equipment was found abandoned along a trail, his memory cards missing. A local TV station did a brief story about unusual animal behavior in the park. Deer abandoning their usual territories, birds going silent in the middle of the day, entire packs of coyotes seemingly vanishing overnight. I started having the dreams again. Not the usual nightmares about that night, but something new. In these dreams, I'm back at the park, but it's different. The trees are older, twisted into impossible shapes. I hear voices calling from the darkness. Sometimes Max is barking, sometimes Jennifer's voice, sometimes sounds that could be human but aren't quite right. And always that sense of something vast and patient watching, waiting, hungry not just for flesh but for something deeper. Last week I received another unmarked envelope. Inside was a USB drive and a handwritten note that simply said, 1,847 to 2,024 inches. The drive contained hundreds of files, police reports, witness statements, historical documents, and photographs spanning nearly 2 centuries. Some were in Jennifer's distinctive organizational style, but others appeared to come from sources I couldn't identify. The most recent file was a satellite image of the Blackwater Falls area taken 3 months ago. It showed something that made my blood run cold, a pattern of dead vegetation forming a perfect spiral, centered on the spot where I'd found Max that night. I've made copies of everything and stored them in secure locations. This account, too, will be preserved in multiple places. I'm writing this not just to document what happened to me, but to warn others. There's something out there, something that's been there longer than the park, longer than the settlers, maybe longer than human memory itself. It operates on a timeline we can barely comprehend, working to a pattern we're only beginning to understand. The locals have their own way of dealing with it. If you visit the small towns around Blackwater Falls, you'll notice certain practices they don't discuss with outsiders. Iron horseshoes above doorways, red threads tied around children's wrists during certain months, the way they never say good night, but instead tell each other to stay in the light. Little traditions passed down through generations, their original meanings lost but their purpose unchanged, to ward off something they've learned to live alongside but never to trust. Dr. Mitchell, my therapist, retired last year. In our final session, she said something that struck me. Sometimes the most rational response to an irrational world is to accept that there are things we don't understand. I've come to believe she's right, but I've also learned that acceptance doesn't mean passivity. I've started compiling my own database, creating my own maps. I maintain contact with a small network of others who've had similar experiences. We're careful, paranoid even, but we share information. We watch for patterns. We keep track of the cycles. The creature I encountered that night may not have been a Wendigo, as some legends suggest, or it might be something that inspired those legends in the first place. Names are less important than understanding, and understanding is less important than survival. What matters is that it's real. It's still out there. And if Jennifer's research is correct, it's becoming more active. I still teach, though I've moved to online-only courses. My students sometimes ask why I never use video for our virtual lectures. They assume it's because I'm old-fashioned or technologically challenged. I let them think that. It's better than explaining that I'm afraid of what might appear in my webcam's background, in the darkness behind me, especially on late autumn evenings when the sun sets early and the shadows grow long. To anyone reading this who might venture into those mountains, be careful. If you're camping and your dog starts acting strange, leave immediately. If you hear familiar voices calling from deep in the woods, don't follow them. And if you're ever at Blackwater Falls as the sun is setting, and you feel eyes watching you from the tree line, don't try to be brave. Don't try to investigate. Just run. Because out there, in the ancient hollows of the Appalachians, something is stirring. Something that remembers every encounter, every witness, every escape. Something that can wait decades between feedings because it knows, with a patience that predates human civilization, that there will always be another curious hiker, another solitary camper, Another person who thinks they're prepared for whatever they might encounter in the wilderness. And sometimes, late at night, when I hear scratching at my window or catch a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision, I wonder if it's still watching me. I wonder if it's been watching all of us all along, treating our brief human lifespans as mere moments in its eternal hunger. I wonder if Max knew, in those final moments, what we'd stumbled into. And I wonder, as the cycle Jennifer identified approaches its peak, how many more will encounter what I did before it retreats again into legend and shadow, waiting for the next cycle to begin. October 16th, 1977. That date is seared into my memory like a brand on cattle. It was the day that changed everything I thought I knew about the world, about nature, about what's really out there in the depths of the forest. My name's Jack Hawkins, and I've been a search and rescue officer in Humboldt County, California for nearly a decade. I thought I'd seen it all, but I was dead wrong. The morning started like any other. I woke up at dawn, the cool autumn air seeping through my bedroom window. The smell of pine and damp earth filled my nostrils as I stepped out onto my porch, coffee in hand. I gazed out at the redwoods that surrounded my cabin, their massive trunks disappearing into the morning mist. Little did I know that in just a few hours, those same trees would become the backdrop to a nightmare. I arrived at the station just as the sun was starting to burn off the fog. Sheriff Tom Landry was already there, his weathered face creased with concern. "Jack," he said, motioning me over. "Got a situation, 2 hikers overdue." I nodded, slipping into work mode. "Details?" Tom handed me a manila folder. "Jessica Roth and Lauren Simmons, both 22, recent grads from Humboldt State. They were supposed to be back Sunday night from a long weekend hike. Families called it in yesterday evening when they couldn't reach them." I flipped through the file. Pictures of 2 smiling young women looked back at me. Jessica, a redhead with freckles and a wide grin. Lauren, darker-skinned with curly black hair and glasses. Both looked like typical college kids, full of life and adventure. "Any idea of their planned route?" I asked, already mentally mapping out the most likely trails. Tom spread out a topographic map on his desk. "They told their families they were planning to hike the old Redwood Creek Trail. It's not heavily trafficked, but it's not particularly challenging either. Mostly used by locals for day hikes." I traced the trail with my finger. It wound through some of the oldest growth in the county, massive redwoods that had stood sentinel for centuries. Beautiful country, but it could turn deadly if you weren't prepared. "All right," I said, straightening up. "I'll head out with a small team. No need for a full search party yet. Probably just got turned around or had some minor equipment failure." Tom nodded, but I could see the worry in his eyes. We both knew that in our line of work, hope for the best but prepare for the worst was more than just a saying. I gathered my gear, backpack with first aid supplies, extra water, high-energy rations, and a handheld radio. I clipped my sidearm to my belt standard procedure, though I'd rarely had cause to use it on rescue operations. As I was heading out, I bumped into Dave Erickson and Beth Cho, 2 of our most experienced volunteer SAR members. "Hey, Jack," Dave called out. "Heard about the missing hikers. Need an extra set of hands?" I sized them up. Dave was in his mid-30s, stocky and strong from years of working as a logger. Beth, a few years younger, was wiry and quick, with keen eyes that didn't miss much. Both had been on dozens of searches with me over the years. "Could use the help," I admitted. "Grab your gear and meet me at the trailhead in 30. They nodded and headed off to prep. I climbed into my beat-up Ford Bronco, the engine growling to life as I turned the key. As I pulled out of the station, I couldn't shake a nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach. Something about this call felt different, off somehow. I shook my head, trying to clear the thoughts. Focus on the facts, on the search. That's what mattered now. The drive to the trailhead took about 45 minutes, winding through increasingly dense forest. The road narrowed, gravel crunching under my tires. I pulled into the small parking area just as Dave and Beth arrived in Dave's pickup. We gathered at the trailhead, going over our gear one last time. The trail stretched before us, disappearing into the gloom of the forest. The redwoods loomed overhead, their massive trunks creating a natural cathedral. Shafts of sunlight pierced through the canopy, illuminating patches of ferns and moss on the forest floor. "All right," I said, shouldering my pack. "We'll follow their planned route. Keep your eyes peeled for any signs of recent passage. Broken twigs, disturbed ground, anything out of place. Radio check every 30 minutes. Let's move out." As we set off down the trail, I couldn't help but feel like we were being watched. I glanced back at the parking lot, now hidden by a bend in the path. The forest seemed to close in around us, swallowing us whole. Little did I know that with each step we were walking deeper into a mystery that would haunt me for the rest of my life. The first mile of the hike was uneventful. The trail was well maintained, winding between the massive redwoods. Shafts of sunlight pierced through the canopy, creating dappled patterns on the forest floor. In any other circumstance, it would have been breathtakingly beautiful. But today, every shadow seemed to hide a potential clue, or a potential threat. "Jack," Beth called out, kneeling by the side of the trail. "Take a look at this." I moved over to where she was crouched. A small piece of bright orange fabric was caught on a thorny bush, fluttering slightly in the breeze. "Good eye," I said, carefully removing the scrap. "Matches the description of Jessica's windbreaker." Dave joined us, peering at the fabric. "Think they went off trail here?" I scanned the surrounding area. The underbrush was thick, but I could make out what might have been a makeshift path pushing through the ferns. "Possibly," I replied. "But let's stick to the main trail for now. Mark this spot on the GPS. We can come back and check it out if we don't find anything further ahead." We pressed on, our senses heightened. Every snapping twig, every rustle in the underbrush drew our attention. The forest seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. About 2 miles in, the trail opened up into a small clearing. It was a popular spot for overnight campers, with a fire pit and a few log benches scattered around. As soon as we entered the clearing, I knew something was wrong. "Oh God," Beth whispered, her face pale. The clearing looked like a war zone. A tent lay in tatters, its fabric shredded and poles bent at unnatural angles. Supplies were scattered everywhere. A sleeping bag hanging from a low branch, a backpack spilling its contents onto the damp earth. What looked like the remains of a meal were strewn across the fire pit, half-eaten and rotting. "Spread out," I ordered, my voice tight. "Look for any signs of the girls, and be careful. Whatever did this might still be around." We moved through the clearing methodically, documenting everything we found. My stomach churned as I came across a single hiking boot, ripped open like it was made of paper. Dark stains marred the leather blood without a doubt. "Jack," Dave called out, his voice shaky. "You need to see this." He was standing at the edge of the clearing, pointing at something on the ground. As I approached, I saw what had caught his attention. A set of tracks led away from the campsite, disappearing into the underbrush. But these weren't human tracks, nor any animal prints I'd ever seen before. The prints were massive, easily twice the size of my own boot. They were deep, too, suggesting whatever made them was incredibly heavy. But it was the shape that sent a chill down my spine. They looked almost human-like, but distorted, with long, curved claw marks at the ends of each toe. "What the hell could have made these?" Dave asked, his face ashen. I shook my head, unable to form a response. In all my years in these woods, I'd never seen anything like this. My mind raced through possibilities. A bear attack? Some kind of large cat? But deep down, I knew these tracks belonged to something else entirely. "We need to call this in," I said, reaching for my radio. "Get a full search team out here, maybe bring in some wildlife experts." As I raised the radio to my lips, a sound echoed through the clearing. It started low, almost below the threshold of hearing, then rose to a piercing shriek that set my teeth on edge. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before, part bird cry, part animal roar, with an almost human-like quality that made my skin crawl. Beth let out a small whimper, her eyes wide with fear. Dave had his rifle up, scanning the tree line. I felt frozen in place, my heart pounding in my chest. Then, as suddenly as it had started, The sound cut off. The silence that followed was deafening. "We need to move," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Now." We gathered our gear quickly, eyes darting to the shadows between the trees. As we prepared to leave the clearing, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. High up in the canopy, something dark and massive shifted, branches creaking under its weight. "Run," I hissed, and we took off down the trail. The forest blurred around us as we ran, branches whipping at our faces. I could hear Beth's ragged breathing behind me, Dave's heavy footfalls to my right. But over it all, I heard something else, the sound of something big moving through the trees, keeping pace with us effortlessly. We burst out of the forest onto an old logging road, gasping for air. I fumbled with my radio, finally managing to get a signal. "This is Officer Hawkins," I panted into the mic. "We need immediate backup at the Redwood Creek trailhead. Possible animal attack. 2 hikers missing. Send everything you've got." As I lowered the radio, I caught Dave's eye. The look on his face mirrored what I was feeling. A mix of fear, confusion, and the sinking realization that we were in way over our heads. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. As darkness began to fall, I couldn't shake the feeling that our ordeal was far from over. Whatever was out there in those woods, whatever had destroyed that campsite and left those impossible tracks, it was still out there. And somehow I knew it was watching us, waiting for its moment to strike. The wait for backup felt like an eternity. We huddled on the logging road, eyes scanning the tree line, jumping at every sound. The forest had gone eerily quiet, as if holding its breath. Even the usual evening chorus of birds and insects was absent, leaving only the whisper of wind through the redwoods. "What do you think it was?" Beth asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head. "I don't know. In all my years out here, I've never seen anything like those tracks." Dave was pacing, his rifle held tight against his chest. "Could it be a bear? Maybe one that's sick or injured?" "No bear I've ever seen moves like that," I replied. "And that sound, that wasn't any animal I know." The crackle of the radio made us all jump. "Officer Hawkins, this is Deputy Collins. We're about 15 minutes out. What's your situation?" I brought the radio to my lips. "We're holding position on the old logging road, about 2 miles in from the trailhead. No visual on the missing hikers, but we found their campsite. It's bad, Collins. Something tore it apart." "Understood," came the reply. "Sit tight. We're coming in hot." As I lowered the radio, a twig snapped in the forest to our left. We all whirled toward the sound, Dave raising his rifle. "Did you see that?" Beth hissed, pointing into the gloom. At first I saw nothing. Then a shadow moved between the trees. Something big, much bigger than a person. It seemed to flow through the undergrowth, more liquid than solid. "Get behind me," I ordered, drawing my sidearm. The shape paused at the edge of the road, partially hidden by a massive redwood. In the fading light I could make out a hulking form, easily 9 feet tall. Thick dark fur covered its body, not brown like a bear's, but a deep oily black that seemed to absorb what little light remained. Then it stepped into full view, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. Its limbs were too long, too powerful, ending in hands, if you could call them that, tipped with claws like butcher's hooks. But it was the face that froze the blood in my veins. The head was squat and wide, perched on a thick muscular neck. But the eyes, God, those eyes. They were huge, easily the size of softballs, and a sickly yellow color that seemed to glow in the twilight. And they were fixed directly on us. For a moment, everything was still. I could hear Beth's ragged breathing behind me, smell the acrid scent of fear rolling off Dave in waves. The creature's chest heaved with each breath, a low rumble emanating from deep within. Then, faster than anything that size had any right to move, it charged. Dave's rifle cracked, the sound impossibly loud in the quiet forest. The creature stumbled, roaring in pain and rage. But it didn't go down. Instead, it seemed to focus all its fury on Dave. "Run!" I screamed, firing my own weapon. The bullet seemed to have little effect, barely slowing the monster's charge. Beth took off down the road, but Dave was frozen in place, fumbling to reload his rifle. I saw the realization in his eyes a split second before the creature reached him. Then, in a blur of fur and flashing claws, Dave went down. The sounds that followed will haunt me for the rest of my life. The ripping of flesh, the cracking of bones, and underneath it all, Dave's agonized screams. I fired again and again, until my clip was empty. The creature barely seemed to notice, focused entirely on its grisly task. When it finally looked up from Dave's broken body, its muzzle was dark with blood. Those yellow eyes locked onto mine, and in that moment, I knew true terror. This wasn't an animal driven by instinct and hunger. There was an intelligence in those eyes, a malevolence that went beyond anything in the natural world. I ran. God help me, I ran and didn't look back. I could hear it behind me, its heavy footfalls shaking the ground. The stench of its breath, hot and rotten, washed over me. I knew I couldn't outrun it, knew that any second those claws would tear into my back. Then, miraculously, I heard sirens in the distance. Blue and red lights flashed through the trees. The creature let out a frustrated roar and veered off into the forest, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. I stumbled onto the road just as the first police cruiser pulled up. Deputy Collins leaped out, his face pale in the flashing lights. "Jack, what the hell happened? Where are the others?" I couldn't speak. My legs gave out and I collapsed to the ground. The last thing I remember before passing out was the taste of blood in my mouth and the lingering image of those terrible yellow eyes. I woke up in the hospital, the steady beep of a heart monitor filling the room. My body ached all over and my throat felt raw, as if I'd been screaming for hours. Maybe I had been. Sheriff Landry was there, his face grim. "Jack," he said softly. "How are you feeling?" I tried to sit up, wincing at the pain. "What happened? Where's Beth? And Dave?" The look on Tom's face told me everything I needed to know. "We found Beth about a mile down the road," he said. "She's shaken up, but physically okay. Dave, I'm sorry, Jack. There wasn't anything left to save." The memories came flooding back. The destroyed campsite, those impossible tracks, and that thing. That monster that had torn Dave apart like he was made of paper. "The hikers?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Tom shook his head slowly. "No sign of them, Jack. We've had search teams combing the area for days. Found some of their gear scattered around, but nothing else." I closed my eyes, feeling a wave of nausea wash over me. Those poor girls, and Dave. God, Dave. His face flashed in my mind, the look of terror in his eyes just before... "Jack," Tom said, his voice gentle but firm, "I need you to tell me exactly what happened out there." I took a deep breath, trying to organize my thoughts. How could I possibly explain what we'd seen? What would happen if I told the truth? Would they think I was crazy? Hell, maybe I was crazy. It was an animal attack," I said finally, the lie tasting bitter on my tongue. "Some kind of bear, maybe. Biggest damn thing I've ever seen. It came out of nowhere, took Dave down before we could..." My voice cracked and I couldn't continue. Tom put a hand on my shoulder, his face a mask of sympathy and barely concealed doubt. "All right, Jack," he said. "Get some rest. We'll talk more later." As he left the room, I knew he didn't believe me. How could he? But I also knew I could never tell him the truth. Who would believe that some creature, something that shouldn't exist, was out there in those woods? The next few weeks passed in a blur. I was released from the hospital, but I couldn't bring myself to go back to work. The nightmares came every night. Dave's screams, those yellow eyes, the feeling of being hunted through endless dark forests. Beth came to see me once. We sat on my porch staring out at the redwoods, not speaking. What was there to say? We both knew what we'd seen, what we'd experienced, but talking about it, acknowledging it out loud, somehow made it more real. "I'm leaving," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Can't stay here anymore. Can't look at those trees without..." She trailed off, but I understood. Part of me wanted to leave too, to run as far from these woods as I could get. But something held me back. A sense of unfinished business, maybe, or the irrational fear that if I left, that thing might follow. Weeks turned into months. Life in the county slowly returned to normal. The search for the missing hikers was called off, their disappearance joining the long list of unsolved mysteries in these parts. Dave's funeral was a somber affair, his casket closed. The official report listed his death as the result of a bear attack. I eventually went back to work, but things were different. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched whenever I'd ventured into the forest. Every shadow held potential danger. Every unexpected sound set my heart racing. My colleagues noticed the change in me, the newfound jumpiness, the way I'd sometimes trail off mid-sentence, lost in thought. It was almost a year later when it happened again. Another missing hiker, another destroyed campsite. I was first on the scene, and as soon as I saw those familiar tracks in the soft earth, I knew. It was back. I stood there, frozen as my radio crackled with calls for backup. In that moment, I made a decision. I couldn't let what happened to Dave, to those girls, happen to anyone else. I had to end this one way or another. I unclipped my radio and set it on a nearby stump. Then, with nothing but my sidearm and the clothes on my back, I set off into the deepening gloom of the forest. The trees seemed to close in around me, branches reaching out like grasping fingers. But for the first time in months, I felt a strange sense of calm. As the last rays of sunlight faded, I heard it. That low, rumbling growl that had haunted my dreams for so long. I turned slowly, and there it was. Those yellow eyes gleamed in the darkness, filled with a terrible intelligence. "All right, you bastard," I whispered, raising my gun. "Let's finish this." The creature let out a roar that shook the very ground, and charged. In that moment, surrounded by the ancient redwoods that had seen so much over the centuries, I faced my nightmare head-on. What happened next? Well, that's a story for another time. But I will say this. There are things in this world that defy explanation, things that lurk in the shadows of our so-called civilization. And sometimes, when the night is dark and the wind whispers through the trees, I swear I can still hear that unearthly howl echoing through the redwoods. So if you ever find yourself in the forests of Humboldt County, stick to the trails. And if you hear something moving in the undergrowth, something too big to be a deer or a bear, run. Run, and don't look back. Because there are some things in this world that man was never meant to face. "8 years is a long time to work anywhere, but out at Lonesome Pine Reserve, time moves differently. Nestled deep in the Appalachians where civilization feels like a distant memory, the reserve sprawls across thousands of acres of dense forest, steep ravines, and forgotten hollows. Most folks don't even know it exists, and that's just how we like it. I'm Saul Hendricks, former Memphis firefighter turned park ranger after a career-ending knee injury. The transition wasn't easy, trading sirens and city lights for the profound silence of these ancient woods, but it suited me. At least it did until last October, when everything I thought I knew about these mountains changed forever. It started with the disappearances. First, it was Carl Mackenzie's goats. 3 of them vanished overnight from his farm just outside the reserve's boundaries. Then the Wilsons lost their shepherd, and the Hendersons their barn cat. People whispered about bears, but I'd tracked enough bears in my time to know better. Bears leave signs, broken branches, scattered garbage, distinctive prints in the mud. This was different. The weather that autumn had been unusual. Thick fog rolled in most mornings, clinging to the valleys until well past noon. The locals said it was the worst they'd seen in decades. The moisture made everything feel heavy, like the air itself was pressing down on you. And then there was the smell. I first noticed it during my routine patrol of the southern boundary. A sickly sweet odor that reminded me of roadkill left too long in the summer sun, but more industrial somehow, like decay mixed with diesel fuel. I radioed Avery about it. She'd been working the northern section for about 5 years, and if anyone would know about strange occurrences, it'd be her. "Probably just a dead deer," she said, her voice crackling through the static. "Though I've been getting complaints about the smell from hikers up here too." That should have been my first warning. Lonesome Pine is vast. A smell carrying that far wasn't natural. The disappearances escalated. The Burke's draft horse, a massive Clydesdale named Thunder, vanished from a locked stable. The gate hadn't been broken. It was still latched from the outside. But inside we found deep gouges in the wooden walls and a strange, viscous substance on the floor that looked like tar but smelled like copper and rot. I started carrying my old hunting rifle on patrols after that. Never needed a weapon before. Most dangerous thing you'd typically encounter was the occasional startled black bear or angry mama moose. But something felt wrong in those woods now. The birds had gone quiet. The usual rustling of small animals in the underbrush had ceased. Even the insects seemed subdued. It was during one of these armed patrols that I found the first real evidence of what we were dealing with. I was checking the old logging trails, obsolete paths that hadn't seen maintenance in years, slowly being reclaimed by the forest. The fog was thick that day, reducing visibility to maybe 20 feet ahead. The smell was overwhelming. The first sign was the blood. Not drops or splashes, but sheets of it, painting the forest floor in cruel, abstract patterns. Following the trail led me to a clearing I didn't recognize, though I thought I knew every inch of this section. The ground had been churned up like a tilled field, but the furrows were deeper, more violent. And there, in the center, lay what remained of Thunder. The horse's massive body had been transformed. Not eaten, not torn apart, transformed. The flesh had been peeled back with surgical precision in some places and savagely ripped away in others. The skeleton had been rearranged, bones twisted into impossible angles, some seemingly melted and reformed. The head was missing entirely. I've seen my share of animal attacks. Bears leave distinctive wounds. Mountain lions are precise. Wolves work as a pack. This was something else entirely. This was methodical yet chaotic, purposeful yet mindless. And it was fresh. Steam still rose from the exposed flesh despite the cool autumn air. That's when I heard it. Have you ever stood in absolute silence? Not the quiet of a library or the stillness of night, but true silence, when even your heartbeat seems muted? That's what happened first. Every ambient sound simply stopped, as if someone had pressed a cosmic mute button. Then came the breathing. It was wet, labored, like someone drowning in their own fluids. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I raised my rifle, turning slowly, trying to locate the source. The fog had thickened, forming a wall around the clearing. And through that wall emerged something that shouldn't exist. It moved like liquid shadow, its form constantly shifting and reforming. The basic shape suggested something vaguely lupine, but the proportions were all wrong. Its shoulders were too broad, its limbs too long and jointed in impossible ways. The head was the worst part, a twisted amalgamation of wolf and boar, with too many eyes that didn't reflect light so much as absorb it. Where its mouth should have been, there was instead a writhing mass of appendages that looked like a cross between tentacles and tongues. The rifle felt pathetically inadequate, but I fired anyway. The sound was deafening in the unnatural silence. The creature jerked as the bullet hit, but instead of blood, a thick black substance oozed from the wound. The hole closed almost immediately. It moved faster than anything that size had any right to. One moment it was at the edge of the clearing, the next it was nearly on top of me. I dove to the side, feeling the wind of its passage as those appendages whipped past my face. The smell of rot and chemicals was overwhelming. I ran. There's no shame in admitting it. Training, experience, weapons, none of it matters when you're faced with something that defies reality itself. I crashed through the underbrush, my bad knee screaming in protest. Behind me I could hear it moving, not the sound of feet or paws, but a wet, slithering noise that seemed to come from all directions. The fog made navigation nearly impossible. Familiar landmarks became alien shapes in the mist. I had no idea if I was heading toward the ranger station or deeper into the wilderness. My foot caught on an exposed root, and I went down hard, the rifle flying from my grasp. I rolled, expecting to feel those appendages wrapping around me at any moment. Instead, I found myself at the edge of a steep ravine. The drop was at least 30 feet, with a creek running along the bottom. The creature emerged from the fog behind me, its form seeming to ripple and flow like smoke. In that moment, I made a choice that probably saved my life. I jumped. The impact with the water drove the air from my lungs. The creek was deeper than it looked, and the current surprisingly strong. I let it carry me downstream, staying under as long as I could. When I finally had to surface for air, I caught a glimpse of the creature pacing along the ravine edge. It made no attempt to follow. I dragged myself out of the water nearly a mile downstream. My radio was ruined, my rifle was lost, and my knee felt like it was on fire. But I was alive. I made it back to the ranger station just as night was falling. Avery was there, along with 2 state troopers who'd been called in about the missing animals. They didn't believe me at first. Who would? But the disappearances continued for another week. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The smell faded. The animals returned. The fog lifted. We never found Thunder's body, though we searched the area thoroughly. The clearing itself seemed to have vanished, as if the forest had swallowed it whole. The official report blamed the incidents on a rogue bear, despite the lack of evidence. The locals developed their own theories, everything from government experiments to ancient curses. I filed my report honestly, knowing it would probably end up buried in some folder marked unexplained. I still work at Lonesome Pine, still patrol those same trails, but I carry my rifle now, and I pay attention to the silences. Sometimes, on foggy days, I catch a whiff of that chemical decay on the wind. When that happens, I turn around and head back to the station. Some things I've learned are better left alone. The mountains are old and they keep their secrets well. What I encountered that day was just one of them, a reminder that the world is stranger and more terrible than we like to admit. I don't expect anyone to believe my story, but I know what I saw. And I know that somewhere in those ancient forests, in the deep hollows where sunlight never reaches, something is waiting. The state police investigation lasted 3 months. They brought in wildlife experts, forensic teams, even a cryptozoologist from the university. They found nothing conclusive, just scattered fur samples that didn't match any known species and strange chemical traces in the soil that the lab couldn't identify. What they did find was a pattern. Every 7 years, going back to the 1940s, Lonesome Pine experienced a surge of unexplained animal disappearances. They always occurred in autumn, always lasted exactly 17 days, and always stopped as suddenly as they began. The records were buried in old ranger logs and local newspaper archives, stories dismissed as tall tales or mass hysteria. But the physical evidence remained. Deep claw marks in old-growth trees, too high for any known predator. Patches of forest where nothing would grow, the soil tainted with that same unidentifiable chemical compound. And photographs, grainy, unclear, but showing something moving through the trees that didn't match any known animal profile. Winter came and went. Spring brought new growth, covering the scars in the forest. I kept expecting to wake up to more missing animals, more strange sounds in the night. But the mountains were quiet, almost too quiet. It wasn't until late March that I found the caves. They were hidden behind a rockfall that the spring thaw had dislodged, a network of tunnels stretching deep into the mountain. The walls were smooth, almost polished, and covered in a familiar black residue. I went in alone, against every protocol and common sense. The tunnels went down for miles, branching and reconnecting like a giant web. In the deepest chamber I found them, hundreds of bones, some fresh, some ancient, all arranged in precise geometric patterns. And on the walls, carved into the stone with surgical precision, were markings that looked eerily like mathematical equations. That's when I understood. What we had encountered wasn't some undiscovered animal species. It was something else entirely. Something that had been here long before us. Something that emerged periodically to feed and study, like a scientist collecting specimens. I sealed the cave entrance with explosives, marking it as unstable on all official maps. Avery helped me cover it up. She'd seen enough herself to know some things are better left buried. The official report cites a geological hazard. 7 years have passed since that autumn. The fog is rolling in again, thick and unnatural. Yesterday I found fresh claw marks on the trees near the sealed cave. The birds have gone quiet. And that smell, that chemical decay, is back on the wind. I've arranged for all the local farmers to move their livestock indoors. The hiking trails are officially closed for maintenance. Avery and I have stocked the ranger station with enough supplies to last a month. We're ready this time, or at least we think we are. The thing about working in places like Lonesome Pine is that you learn to respect the unknown. The mountains have their own rules, their own rhythms. Some things out here don't fit into our neat categories of natural and supernatural. They simply are. I still patrol these trails, still carry my rifle, though I know now it won't do much good if that thing returns. But I watch the fog, and I listen to the silences, and I remember what I learned in that cave. We're not alone in these mountains. We never were. Sometimes on quiet nights when the moon is hidden and the wind whispers through the trees, I think I hear something moving in the darkness. Something vast and ancient and patient. And I wonder if what we encountered was just a scout, a single specimen from a larger colony sleeping somewhere in the deep places of the earth, waiting for their time to emerge. My name is Saul Hendricks, and this is my warning. If you find yourself in these mountains when the fog rolls in thick and unnatural, when the birds go quiet and that sweet chemical smell fills the air, run. Run as fast and as far as you can. Because every 7 years, something wakes in Lonesome Pine, and it's hungry for more than just livestock. I never expected my years as a Girl Scout to end with me questioning everything I believed about reality. Looking back now, I can trace a clear line from those early camping trips to the night that changed my life forever. But let me start at the beginning. I joined the Scouts at age 12, a shy kid who preferred books to people and indoor comforts to outdoor adventures. My parents thought it would build character and help me make friends. They weren't entirely wrong. Those first few months were challenging, learning knots, practicing first aid, and trying to start fires with nothing but twigs and determination. But something unexpected happened. I fell in love with the wilderness. Larch Hill became my second home. Located in the heart of the Wicklow Mountains, the campsite was a world unto itself. Dense forests of towering pines surrounded the clearing, their branches reaching toward each other like old friends sharing secrets. The mountains loomed in the distance, their peaks often shrouded in mist, creating an atmosphere that could shift from welcoming to menacing as quickly as the Irish weather. Our troop met every other weekend, but the overnight camping trips were what I lived for. We'd learn wilderness survival skills during the day, how to read maps, identify edible plants, and track animals. But it was the nights that really shaped us. Huddled around campfires, we'd share stories and forge friendships that felt unbreakable. Sarah became my best friend during one of these trips, when we both refused to eat the questionable stew our troop leader had prepared, and ended up sharing a package of cookies instead. The ghost stories were always my favorite part. Each scout leader had their own version of the Lady of Larch Hill legend. Some said she was a young woman who got lost in the woods during a storm in the 1800s and still wandered the paths, searching for her way home. Others claimed she was the spirit of a heartbroken girl who died waiting for her lover to return from war. The older scouts whispered that she appeared to hikers who strayed too far from the marked trails, either warning them away from danger or luring them deeper into the forest, depending on who was telling the tale. I never took these stories seriously. Growing up in a household that valued science and rational explanation above all else, I dismissed them as campfire entertainment. Ghost stories were meant to scare younger scouts and add excitement to our camping trips. Nothing more. By 16, I had earned nearly every outdoor badge available. I could start a fire in the rain, navigate by stars, and identify dozens of local plants and animals. The mountains had become my sanctuary, a place where the anxieties of teenage life melted away. Sarah and I were inseparable, planning future hiking adventures and dreaming about leading our own scout troops someday. That's what makes what happened next so difficult to reconcile. How could someone who knew these woods so well, who prided herself on being practical and level-headed, experience something so impossible? The events of that night forced me to question everything I thought I knew about reality, about science, about what lurks in the spaces between what we can explain and what we can only fear. It started with a simple argument, the kind of petty disagreement that only teenage best friends can have. I don't even remember what sparked it now, though the consequences of that fight are forever etched in my memory. If Sarah and I hadn't been mad at each other, would we have still ventured out into the darkness that night? Would we have seen what we saw? The layout of Larch Hill campsite is crucial to understanding what happened. The main entrance opened onto a large gravel parking area with the welcome center and bathrooms positioned to the right. A long gravel path stretched straight ahead, with various camping fields branching off on either side. Our troop always preferred the backfield. It was more private and offered the best views of the mountains. That weekend, we had set up our camp with military precision, just as we'd been taught. The mess tent stood near the field entrance, serving as a landmark visible from anywhere in camp. Our sleeping tents were arranged in a rough semicircle at the bottom of the field, with Sarah's and mine positioned at the far end. One side of the field butted up against a dense line of trees and bushes, the beginning of the true forest that covered the mountainside. What happened that night began with a simple need and ended with a fundamental shift in how I view the world. But to understand the full impact, you need to know about the strange events that had been occurring in the weeks leading up to our fateful camping trip. Looking back, there were warnings, subtle at first, easily dismissed by those of us trained to seek rational explanations. 3 weeks before our final camping trip, our troop was doing routine maintenance on the trails when Emily, one of our younger scouts, came running back to the group. She was pale and shaking, claiming she'd seen a woman in a white dress standing among the trees, who vanished when Emily tried to get a closer look. Emily's sighting was just the beginning. During subsequent trips, other scouts reported odd occurrences, equipment moving overnight despite being properly secured, footprints appearing in muddy areas where no one had walked, and most disturbingly, the sound of someone humming an unfamiliar melody in the darkness beyond our campfire's light. Our troop leaders dismissed these stories as overactive imaginations, but I noticed they started enforcing the buddy system more strictly and rarely let anyone venture far from the main camp alone. Even the most experienced scouts were required to travel in pairs after sunset. Sarah and I discussed these incidents during our late-night conversations in our tent. Despite my skepticism, I couldn't help but notice how the atmosphere at Larch Hill had changed. The familiar comfort of the woods had been replaced by something more oppressive, as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting. The weekend of our final trip started normally enough. Our troop arrived Friday afternoon, the van pulling into the gravel parking area under overcast skies. The air was heavy with the promise of rain, but the forecast suggested it would hold off until Sunday. Perfect camping weather, cool enough to justify a roaring campfire but not so cold that we'd be uncomfortable in our tents. Sarah and I worked together setting up camp with the efficiency of long practice, though tension still simmered between us from our earlier argument. It was such a stupid fight. She'd accused me of flirting with her crush at school, while I maintained I was just being friendly. Looking back, the petty drama of teenage life seems almost laughable compared to what was coming. That evening, our troop leader announced we'd be doing a night hike the following day, taking advantage of the full moon to practice our navigation skills. Several of the younger scouts expressed nervousness, but I was excited. Night hikes were rare treats, usually reserved for the most experienced scouts. We spent Saturday preparing for the hike, checking our gear and reviewing trail maps. The plan was to follow the Eastern Ridge Trail, which offered spectacular views of the valley below. It was a moderately challenging route I'd hiked dozens of times in daylight, but darkness would add an entirely new dimension to the experience. The sun set early that Saturday, the light fading rapidly behind thick clouds that had rolled in during the afternoon. Our group of 12 gathered at the trailhead, headlamps ready but initially off to let our eyes adjust to the darkness. The air was unusually still, the typical evening breeze absent. Our troop leader, Miss O'Brien, gave us final instructions. Stay together, maintain visual contact with the person in front and behind, and most importantly, stay on the marked trail. We set off in single file, our footsteps muffled by the carpet of pine needles beneath our boots. The first hour passed uneventfully. The clouds occasionally parted, allowing glimpses of the full moon to illuminate our path. The forest was eerily quiet, no owls calling, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Even our group's chatter gradually died away, replaced by focused concentration on the path ahead. I was positioned near the middle of the line, with Sarah 2 people behind me. Despite our lingering disagreement, her presence was reassuring. The familiar trail seemed different in the darkness, shadows transforming familiar landmarks into mysterious shapes that teased the imagination. Then someone at the front of the line stopped abruptly. We heard Miss O'Brien consulting her map and GPS, speaking quietly with her assistant leader. Something was wrong. We should have reached the viewpoint overlooking the valley, but instead, dense forest surrounded us on all sides. The realization that we were off course triggered a ripple of unease through the group. Miss O'Brien maintained a calm demeanor, but I could hear the concern in her voice as she discussed options with the other leaders. According to the GPS, we were somehow nearly a kilometer west of where we should have been, despite following what we thought was the eastern trail. That's when we heard it. A soft humming carried on the still air, the same melody other scouts had reported hearing. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, making it impossible to identify its source. Several of the younger scouts huddled together while the leaders tried to maintain order. I felt a sudden urge to follow the sound, an almost physical pull toward something in the darkness beyond our lights. Sarah must have sensed my intention because she grabbed my arm, whispering urgently, "Don't even think about it." But the humming grew louder, more insistent. And now there was something else, a faint light weaving between the trees, like someone carrying a lantern at a great distance. Miss O'Brien ordered everyone to stay together, but the group was already fragmenting, some drawn toward the light while others wanted to retreat. What happened next occurred so quickly that later accounts from different scouts varied wildly. The light we'd seen suddenly multiplied, dozens of ghostly orbs dancing between the trees. The humming reached a fever pitch and then abruptly stopped, plunging us into absolute silence. In the beam of my headlamp, I saw something move. At first, I thought it was another scout, but the figure was wrong. Too tall, too thin, its movements unnaturally fluid. It stepped into the light, and several people screamed. The entity before us defied description, seeming to shift and change even as we watched. One moment it appeared as the legendary Lady of Larch Hill, wearing a flowing white dress that moved in a non-existent wind. The next it was something ancient and terrifying, its form suggesting a creature that had walked these woods long before humans arrived. Its face, if you could call it that, was a void, a darkness deeper than the night around us. But somehow I knew it was looking directly at me. In that moment I understood with terrible clarity that all our ghost stories and legends had barely scratched the surface of what truly dwelled in these woods. "Run!" Miss O'Brien's command shattered our paralysis. The group scattered, headlamp beams cutting wild arcs through the darkness as everyone fled in different directions. I grabbed Sarah's hand and we ran blindly, branches whipping at our faces, roots threatening to trip us with every step. Behind us, something pursued. We could hear it moving through the forest, not the crash of something large, but a subtle whisper of movement that somehow seemed worse. The humming returned, now discordant and threatening, growing louder as our pursuer gained ground. Sarah stumbled and nearly fell, but I held onto her hand so tightly I later found bruises on both our palms. We crashed through a thorny bush, pain barely registering through our panic. My headlamp beam caught glimpses of other scouts running through the trees, but in the chaos, it was impossible to know if we were heading toward safety or deeper into danger. Then Sarah's headlamp illuminated something familiar, the gravel path leading to the main campsite. We'd somehow made it back to Larch Hill. We ran harder, the sound of our feet on gravel oddly reassuring after the soft forest floor. Behind us, the presence that had been pursuing us seemed to hesitate at the edge of the woods. We reached the welcome center to find other groups of scouts arriving from different directions, all wide-eyed and breathing hard. Over the next hour, everyone made it back except Emily and one of the junior leaders. A search party was organized, and they were found huddled in a hollow tree less than 100 meters from the camp, both physically unhurt, but deeply shaken. The official report claimed we had simply gotten lost and panicked, our minds playing tricks on us in the darkness. But sitting in the welcome center that night, drinking hot chocolate with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, we all knew the truth. Something had lured us off the trail deliberately, something that wanted... what? To frighten us, to harm us, to warn us? None of us could agree. The events of that night changed us all. Emily never returned to Scouts, and several others dropped out in the following weeks. Sarah and I stayed, but we never again participated in night hikes. Our silly argument was forgotten, replaced by a bond forged in shared terror. Over the years, I've researched similar incidents in the Wicklow Mountains. There are other stories, though most people are reluctant to share them. A hiker who encountered something impossible on a solo trek. A camping group that packed up and left in the middle of the night, leaving most of their gear behind. A photographer who captured something in the background of a landscape shot that made him destroy the entire memory card. The Lady of Larch Hill legend has evolved. Younger scouts now tell stories about the night our troop encountered something in the woods. Like all good ghost stories, the details change with each telling, but the core truth remains. There are things in this world that defy explanation, things that remind us how little we truly understand about the dark places of the earth. It's been 10 years since that night, but I still dream about it. In my dreams, I'm running through those dark woods again, but sometimes I stop and turn around, trying to understand what was chasing us. I always wake up before I see its face clearly. Sarah and I remained close friends through university, bonded by our shared experience. We've tried to make sense of what happened, exploring various theories from the scientific to the supernatural. But in the end, we've had to accept that some questions don't have satisfying answers. I still hike and camp. You can't let fear rule your life, but never alone, and never at night. I've returned to Larch Hill several times during daylight hours. The place looks different now. The Welcome Center has been renovated. New trails have been marked, and solar-powered lights illuminate the main paths after dark. But sometimes, standing at the edge of those woods, I hear a faint humming on the wind. And I know that whatever we encountered that night is still there, waiting in the darkness between the trees, between what we know and what we fear to know. The Lady of Larch Hill may have been just a story we told around campfires, but something far more ancient and mysterious dwells in those woods. It was there long before us, and it will remain long after we're gone. A guardian or a predator, or perhaps something we humans simply lack the capacity to understand. I've learned to live with the uncertainty, but I'll never forget the night that showed me how thin the boundary is between our orderly, rational world and the mysteries that lurk just beyond the reach of our flashlight beams. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear that haunting melody in my dreams, calling me back to the darkness of Larch Hill